Over the last few centuries, we have gotten pretty good at delaying death. There are some statistics that since 1840, we've actually been adding on a good 3 months of life expectancy every single year. And now we actually have experts and theorists on aging and longevity projecting that the first people to live to be 150 years old have already been born. 150 years old. I've had people tell me, kill me now. If that means my work life is going to be 60, 80, or 100 years long. Suddenly, this seems like an overwhelming kind of future of work. But it's actually not as far-fetched as we might think. Because today, we have people staying in the workforce at historically high rates, well into their 60s and 70s. And they often average about 12 job changes by the time they retire. So for the rest of us, still deeply immersed in the workforce, it's not that unfathomable for us to conceive that we might be going through 20 or 30 job changes to come, or more. Suddenly, with this kind of new time horizon, it makes us realize that the future of work is long, and that we may have to think about ongoing skill development as a way of life. So no longer are we looking at this framing of sort of learn, earn, retire, where most of our education is front-loaded in the first quarter of our lives. But we suddenly have to think about a new mindset of learn, earn, repeat. And how in the world are we going to contend with that future of work, right? What does that look like? And I think as job seekers, all of us, even if we have fulfilling jobs today, we will all have to become working learners, right? Seeking out continuous new roles and adapting to this uncertainty. And as we think about our work ahead, I wanted to just give you a few insights from the research that I've been able to be a part of to help guide you in this uncertainty. First is we just have to kind of switch our mindsets into separating. We tend to separate the future of education and the future of work as two separate kind of trending conversations. They are one and the same as we think about this kind of new time horizon, and they are inseparable. Right? We have to kind of move into this new mindset of thinking about the ways in which we are already having to get smart fast in different areas. Today, you're already probably noticing certain things that are coming up at work that make you maybe feel a little bit uncomfortable, right? People are talking about search engine optimization or cloud computing or whatever the newfangled technology may be that you realize you need to get smart on fast, right? And how do we begin to skill ourselves up for that future? And sometimes the kind of skilling up that we need to take part of is not actually a technological or technical kind of skill that we need to build. Sometimes the thing that is actually preventing us from progressing or advancing is the development of our human skills that we bring to the table. And human skills go by many names, right? We talk about them as soft skills, 21st century competencies, workforce competencies, work readiness skills. We have a lot of different kinds of names for them. But essentially what we're talking about is the kind of skills that technology cannot necessarily replace. And there have been so many different kinds of prognostications about the ways in which our jobs or our tasks may become obsolete by this kind of proliferation of artificial intelligence and computerization. But there's this notion that kind of emerged in the early 90s of a T-shaped learner, right? And it's this idea that all of us bring a sort of subset of human skills to the table as well as sets of technical skills. And sometimes it's kind of this broad-based expertise that we really need to rely on. Other times we need some of these technical skills in order to be dangerous. But it's important that we also get really granular about what these skills are and how they actually show up in our domains. Because it matters greatly the kind of language we use when we talk about things like communication, critical thinking, right, synthesis, and systems thinking. We all want these kinds of skills out of our employees. But sometimes these broad-based terms don't do us any good. And the reason why is because when we talk about a skill like communication, it means something very different in behavioral health. It might sound more like crisis counseling or intervention work versus when we're talking about it in marketing. In marketing, you better be ready to do some storytelling, right? And brand management and write some press releases. Whereas in public policy, that might look a little bit more like a strategic communications role. Or in HR, you better be ready to write some handbooks and do some internet recruiting and onboarding. It's not exactly the same skill that we think of in these broad terms, right? When we think about something like problem solving. In finance, that might look more like forecasting. It shows up differently. Whereas that same skill of problem solving in marketing may look like lead gen. And in HR, we might actually be looking for someone who's skilled at succession planning. So these names matter a lot because we can't just kind of go out onto the job market and say, I'm a great communicator, you're looking for a comms person, here's a happy marriage, right? That just doesn't exist. Those kinds of connections between our supply and demand don't occur because we're not super specific about the skills we actually need in our people and in our teams. And these things matter greatly because as we all move through life as working learners, and as we move and engage with different employers seeking out new talent for the future, we have to remember that that T-shaped learner is also a model that is not super adequate for what we have to contend with in the future. It's going to look a little bit more jagged like this, where sometimes we're going to need to bring some emotional intelligence to the table, that kind of horizontal line. Other times we're going to need to bring some artificial intelligence to the table, right? We're going to need to rely on these different kinds of technical skills. Sometimes we're going to need real depth. You cannot necessarily engage in roles in cybersecurity without that kind of real depth. Whereas other times we might be able to get away with a shallow understanding of cloud computing or cloud services, right? It depends on the context that we are in. And this is a very different model for us because where are we going to get this kind of learning? What does that infrastructure look like for us to continuously upskill and reskill throughout our longer working lives? And this is where I wanted to share with you some of the research from my book, Long Life Learning, because this was actually prior to the pandemic when I was actually chatting with and interviewing about 100 adults in this particular group of folks who were already being left behind by our present of work. What I mean by that is that these were people who were falling through the cracks of our current infrastructure of education and training today. These were people who only had a high school degree and or maybe a little bit of college, but these were folks who were not thriving in the labor market. They were not earning a living wage. And it's important to look at what is happening for the people who are struggling the most today, because it opens up a way for us to begin to design what I call a new learning ecosystem for all of us to actually move through these continuous returns to learning. And so I wanted to share with you a couple of the perspectives from these people, and then I'll keep going. Let's see if this works.
I feel like I could learn to do most jobs, but I understand the reality of the job market is you have to come in saying, I already know how to do this. No one's going to give you 6 months to figure out how to do a job.
I was laid off, and for the first time, the relevance of not having a degree became manifest because even though I had years upon years, over 20 years of experience doing all these different things, the first question they were asking is, so where'd you go to school? The last time I actually had to go looking for a job, we did things like talk to people face to face, and that's completely gone now. And you just end up getting put into a slot, and as a result, they don't know who you are. They just look at, has he gone to school? No, so then you go into that pile.
Because you don't learn how to finance when you're poor. So you don't learn how to look, you almost ignore your finances. And I had to learn to look at them to be able to manage them. But that's a huge, overwhelming gap.
But I knew that in order to make a livable wage, at the time I think they were paying me like a little over minimum wage, which you can't live on if you wanted to. I needed to put something in front of my name or behind my name to, one, separate myself from being a criminal, and also to make me legitimate in some ways.
Generally, my routine was I didn't have a car at the time. I was riding a bicycle, and I would put my children on the school bus for school and ride my bike and clean houses for the doctors and the dentists down in the high-end neighborhoods, and then ride my bike up to school, and I'd audio tape my classes and ride home and meet the kids, and then let them play and cook dinner and do all those preparatory things that you do with children. And after they're bathed and they're sitting there, watching TV or relaxing before bed, I'd put my headsets, listen to my lecture again, and I'd be sewing wedding dresses at this long table that I had, and I would just be sewing dresses and listening to the lecture. On the weekends, I was driving a taxi.
I mean, when I went to orientation, it was crazy. It was overwhelming. I saw all these young people, sitting next to me, and I was like, I do not belong here. What am I doing? These are kids that are coming out of high school, and I can be their mother. That's what I'm going to be in the classroom, and I really don't want to be that. Plus, I have experience. I have experience. I don't have a paper that can show that I have knowledge.
I can say yes or no. Have you ever been convicted? That question on the application, the box, right? Yeah. So that question comes up. So I'm just like, how am I supposed to succeed? And everything keeps you stuck. You can only do so much. They want me to work doing construction, mindless work, but that's not me. I can work with my hands, but my mind is not being fed. My mind needs to be fed for me to feel like I'm encouraged, like I'm involved in something.
People are working hard. People are working so hard. And people don't have opportunities that other people have. And it doesn't mean they're not smart.
It felt like punishment, just to try to get ahead. I have this go get it spirit, but I was never in a position or given that support of hope to keep going forward. You know what I mean? And I knew that's where I wanted to go, was forward.
The Greek word to incite means to put a flame underneath. And I want to incite some learning as well as some dreaming.
I realize that most of the folks in the room are employed and probably have some fulfilling jobs today. But I think these stories, this incredible stuckness that you're hearing from these learners is something that resonates for all of us, because we all have people in our lives, whether they're our children, our cousins, our family members, our friends, who are struggling to figure out how they can move forward. And the reason why this is critical for us to solve, even if we may not be in the same boat today, is that when we actually move forward, we're going to run into some of these same constraints in the future. And this is really this idea of curb cut effects that I wanted to kind of bring to the table. And it's this idea that, as you think about just the creation of sloping curbs in the US with the introduction of the Americans with Disabilities Act, this very simple design was universal, was usable, was accessible, and it enabled not only people who were in wheelchairs or struggling with mobility issues, but they helped all of us, right? When we're riding our skateboards or bicycling or pushing a dolly or pulling our luggage or pushing a stroller, this kind of simple universal design actually opens up a way forward for all of us. And this is the thing with those stories. When you actually listen to these stories over and over again and talk to more people who are struggling to make it today, the same 5 elements keep coming up in these conversations, and that's really what this research is about. And that is, in order for us to develop a healthier learning ecosystem for the future, we need to design something that is more easily navigable, that's more supportive, it's more targeted, it's more integrated, and more transparent. And what I mean by navigation is simply understanding a roadmap, a kind of GPS. How do we actually move forward from where we are today relative to where do we want to go, right? How do I actually understand the skill sets I bring to the table as someone who's maybe cared for a child with special needs or a parent with Alzheimer's? I have different kinds of hidden skills and credentials that I bring to the table that are not actually formally recognized by any kind of diploma or certification or certificate. Right? How do I understand that maybe I actually have the skills to move me forward to a role in human resources or to be a systems network analyst, and that I'm actually 60% of the way there, and that I just have certain gaps to fill? And this is the part of where we need to enable better career navigation supports for all of us, for all of our learners, to understand how they begin to move forward, how they begin to see that roadmap ahead. And the great news is there is a lot of innovation going on here. There are a lot of different kinds of AI-based platforms that are helping enterprises and companies actually assess their talent and understand what skills each of their employees actually bring to the table so that they can begin to understand how they might shape them into the skills for the future. In one really interesting example, one of the companies actually went into an enterprise, this AI-based company went into a company that had laid off 3,000 people. When they actually looked at the profiles of those 3,000 people, they realized that a good percentage of them could actually be molded into those jobs of the future that were part of the strategic plan for the enterprise. It was just that the enterprise had no idea of how to capture and understand the skills that those people brought to the table. And so it begins to do some of this analysis and surfacing work for us to understand how we begin to see what gaps we might begin to fill in our incumbent workforce. Support services are key for all of us as we try to juggle the responsibilities of advancing through education, whatever that new training is that we're trying to acquire, while supporting all of the stuff going on in our daily lives, right? The responsibilities that we bring to the table. That is inordinately difficult to do. And for most people, what we have realized in adult learners today is that no matter how motivated they are, the things that dog them are often outside of the classroom or outside of the training program. These are the things that get in the way of their pursuit of more education in order to advance. Sometimes these are small things like MetroCard subway tickets. Other times it could be slightly larger, access to a food pantry or childcare services. And then sometimes they are much more substantial in terms of understanding how to deal with trauma and mental health supports. But we need to understand how we bring support services to the table to help coach people and knit these pieces together. The third element is something that we call targeted education. And that is, as we think about the over 4,200 institutions that we have that give out four-year degrees in the US, and we think about the over 967,734 credentials that are flooding our education and labor markets, how do we actually know what competency we need to build and which learning experience will actually launch us into that better economic opportunity? We don't have a lot of mechanisms to help show us the way forward. And we all know 95% of adults realize that they must engage in lifelong learning, but they don't always want every element of a bundled degree program to move them forward. So how are they supposed to sift through this and understand that this particular learning experience or this boot camp is going to be the one that has the greatest ROI for me as I move forward? It's inordinately difficult to understand what skills I need, right? And our skills are different depending on our pathways. A financial analyst might need some project management skills or some Scrum skills. Someone else that is a machinist in Wichita might need some quality control or lean manufacturing practices to bring to the table. Sometimes I'm going to need maybe to work on my emotional intelligence or EQ in order to move forward. And that's not something I can take necessarily in a 1-hour LinkedIn learning course, right? How do I build those skills and understand which of the nearly 1 million credentials out there is going to help me move forward? Where am I going to get those 4 or 7 or 11 competencies or skills that I need? And how do I also make sure that it doesn't take me away from earning a living? And that's what's meant by this idea of integrated earning and learning. We actually have data from Peter Capelli over at Wharton, and he's actually shown us that really over the last 4 decades, we have seriously disinvested in our incumbent workforces. So in 1979, we used to devote maybe about 2.5 weeks worth of training our new employees. That has dwindled to, in 1995, we maybe gave about 11 hours of training. Today, 44% of employers offers zero upskilling opportunities for their employees. How are we going to build toward the future without carving out the time during the workday for people to begin to build these skills for the future? Even these minimal 11 hours, which are probably fewer today, right, as we sit here in 2023, these hours are not devoted to skills building for the future. They're about risk mitigation, compliance training. These are the hours that you have to spend taking that sexual harassment training. It's not necessarily about building those emerging skills. And here's why this is so critical. Without more investment here, we are just going to continue to be incredibly stuck. And this is actually some research that I did for the Harvard Business Review. And it's okay that you can't read everything. I just want you to see these visuals. This is some research we published right at the beginning of the pandemic. And the point of this was to show that we actually have the data out there. We have big data to show us the moves that people make and in terms of how they migrate through our workforce. Now, these big gray chunks, these are the sectors of customer service, transportation, and hospitality, the 3 most hardest hit sectors when our pandemic first began. And as you would expect, the gray is just showing you how many people actually just continue to stay in one job in that same sector throughout their work lives. And we looked at a 10-year period and people staying in these jobs for over 3 months at a time. And as you would expect, a lot of people who start off in customer service and retail stay in that sector. But we also know from these colors that certain people actually move forward into better and more promising opportunities. But the numbers are very, very low. And what we can also do through big data is we can actually show how actually if you start off in customer service and retail and add in some talent sourcing skills and payroll and benefits administration, you could move into a better paying human resources role. Or you can add on other skills in as you move from transportation and warehousing to actually go into a more promising business operations role. These moves are actually existent, even though they are small. But most of us have to kind of fumble our way through instead of understanding how clearly we can actually move forward. And how do we do that in an environment in which we can actually learn in the flow of work, right? It's very hard to find a place that will actually carve out time during the day to help us gain these new skills for the future. But as we move forward, we really do need to reconceive of the workplace as the classroom of the future. If we really understand that the future of work is one and the same as the future of education, it needs to happen in the flow of work. And then finally, we have this concept of transparent hiring. We hear a lot about this interest in skills-based hiring practices, and that is because we have long relied on the credential, on a degree, as a proxy for quality. But we're realizing that we're not necessarily getting the talent that we need, and we inadvertently, when we put in more and more minimum degree requirements into our job postings, we actually narrow the funnel. We overlook people who could actually prove that they could do the work ahead because we don't understand at a skills-based level how to hire, how to give people a chance to prove that they can do the work ahead. So just a few takeaways as we think about where we can go forward. We need to start getting really, really creative about how we look at our internal talent and build out mobility pathways for them, right? We need to get creative about how we help them understand and surface their existing skills to move forward into paths that maybe they didn't even know were within reach. We have to think about skills adjacencies. We love the idea of career pivots. They are inordinately difficult to enact, right? even if I have sales experience and I want to move into marketing, the two roles are very adjacent to one another, but we don't have mechanisms that enable a hiring manager to take that chance, to take a risk. It feels very risky to hire someone who doesn't have precisely the prior experience we are looking for. But we all know that we have deeply transferable skills. We just have to figure out how to enable those kinds of skills adjacencies and make them clear. We also have to understand how much we are turning over in terms of our own people. We talk about human capital as our greatest asset, yet we don't actually measure what our interventions are doing in terms of creating that sort of sense of loyalty within the workforce. There's a huge, unfounded myth that if we invest in our existing employees, they will leave us for our competitors. I want to tell you that there's absolutely no data out there to support this. It is a myth, but it has this kind of long-standing, enduring nature because we don't actually measure our current churn. But if we begin to actually put numbers to the investments in our own people, I think we're actually going to see the exact opposite occur, where people are going to feel that sense of loyalty because they feel that they're actually being given a pathway for advancement internally. And then I just want us to remember that what the pandemic showed us was this concept of time poverty. Suddenly, we couldn't outsource and buy time for ourselves, right? We couldn't put our children in childcare. We couldn't get that babysitter. We couldn't get help to help us buy time to do other things. Most of us have a large number of responsibilities that we are trying to juggle every single day, right? So how are we going to actually carve out time for people while they are in that flow of work to begin to build those skills for the future? We need to understand how we begin to practice these skills, because some of these skills take time. When we talk about emotional intelligence and empathy, again, these things that we can't just practice in one moment. We can't take a 2-week boot camp in it and suddenly become skilled in it. We need ways to practice these skills. So how are we going to enable this sort of work? It requires deep, deep practice. And the reason why I just wanted to share all of these insights with you is that the future of work is not, this isn't something that we need to think about for these people in the video. It's actually selfishly about all of us. Because as we think back to those 20 or 30 job changes to come, we are actually going to run into the same constraints on our time and resources as the people who are struggling the most today. It's this concept that Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. came up with, right? It's this web of mutuality that we are all enmeshed in. Something that actually affects one affects all of us. So we can't actually just kind of hope and pray that someone will figure this out. We actually have to begin to knit together these elements of a learning infrastructure and a learning ecosystem to actually make this smoother for all of us. So that ideally, we can in the future pull anyone off the sidewalk and say, hey, how are you going to actually navigate your next job change? And they're going to know exactly who to call, where to go, which learning experience to pick, which employer to pick, right? That they get a fair shot in proving that they can do the work ahead. That's unfathomable today, right? For us, we all navigate this in really uncertain ways, right? We fumble our way through. But as we think about the difficulties of navigating just a single job change, we need to think forward to that learning ecosystem of those 20 and 30 job changes to come. And the question is, right, when you're 70 and looking at another 20 or 30 years in the workforce ahead, what do you want your learning ecosystem to look like? Thank you.